The morning sun cast long shadows across the barren yard where Sarah Mackenzie stood, her weathered hands gripping the porch railing as she watched the dust settle from another group of townspeople who had ridden past without so much as a nod. Their averted eyes and quickened pace spoke louder than any words could have. She was the widow of a debtor, the woman whose husband had left her with nothing but shame and a ramshackle cabin on the wrong side of respectability. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something wild and untamed that reminded her how far she lived from the safety of civilization. Out here, beyond the last fence posts and cultivated fields, the land belonged to itself and to those who understood its harsh rhythms. Sarah had learned to read those rhythms in the 2 years since Thomas died, learned to watch the sky for storms and the horizon for trouble. She pulled her faded shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped down from the porch. The chickens scattered before her as she made her way toward the creek, carrying the wooden bucket that had been her constant companion since the well had run dry last month. The creek ran clear and cold, fed by mountain springs that never seemed to fail even in the driest seasons. It was one of the few reliable things left in her life. As she knelt beside the water, filling the bucket with practiced efficiency, Sarah allowed herself a moment to appreciate the relative peace of this place. The townspeople might shun her, might whisper behind their hands about Thomas's gambling debts and her stubborn refusal to marry again just to secure her future. But here by the creek she could pretend that their opinions didn't matter. Here she could simply be a woman drawing water, nothing more and nothing less. The sound reached her before she saw its source, a desperate thrashing accompanied by high-pitched cries that made her blood run cold. Sarah dropped the bucket and ran toward the sound, her boots slipping on the muddy bank as she followed the creek around a bend. What she saw there made her heart stop. A child, no more than 8 or 9 years old, was trapped in a patch of quicksand that had formed where a spring fed into the creek. His dark hair was plastered to his head with sweat and muddy water, and his eyes were wide with terror as he struggled against the sand that held him fast. Each movement only seemed to pull him deeper. As people from all corners of the world gather to hear this story, I wonder where you're listening from right now. Are you somewhere safe and warm, or are you facing your own kind of wilderness tonight? Whatever brought you here, you're part of something bigger now, a moment shared across time and distance. Sarah didn't hesitate. She had seen quicksand before, had watched it claim a calf just last spring, and she knew that every second counted. The child's struggles were growing weaker, his small body beginning to tire from the effort of fighting the relentless pull of the sand. She looked around desperately for something, anything that might help. Her eyes fell on a fallen cottonwood branch, thick enough to bear weight but light enough for her to manage. Sarah dragged it to the edge of the quicksand and called to the boy in the universal language of urgency and compassion. "Stay still," her gesture said. "Don't fight it. Trust me." The child's eyes met hers, and she saw something that made her breath catch. These were not the eyes of any settler child she had ever known. The shape, the color, the intelligence that blazed there despite his fear, all spoke of heritage that would make her actions not just dangerous but potentially deadly. This was an Apache child, one of the people her neighbors spoke of only in whispers and curses. For a heartbeat, Sarah wavered. Helping this child would mark her as a traitor in the eyes of everyone she had ever known. If anyone discovered what she was about to do, her already precarious position in the community would become impossible. She would be branded not just a debtor's widow but an Indian lover, a betrayer of her own kind. But then the child slipped deeper, the sand reaching his chest now, and Sarah's hesitation evaporated like morning mist. She stretched the branch toward him, speaking in the soothing tones she might use with a frightened animal. "Easy now. Take hold. I've got you." The boy understood her intent if not her words. His small hands closed around the branch with desperate strength, and Sarah began the careful process of pulling him free. The quicksand released its grip reluctantly, with obscene sucking sounds that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. Sarah braced her feet against a boulder and pulled steadily, never jerking or rushing despite the urgency that thrummed through her veins. Inch by inch, the child emerged from his sandy prison. When he was finally free, he collapsed on solid ground, gasping and trembling with exhaustion and shock. Sarah knelt beside him, her own hands shaking as she checked him for injuries. Apart from being covered in mud and sand, he seemed unharmed, but his eyes had closed and his breathing was shallow. Without thinking, Sarah gathered the child into her arms. He was lighter than she had expected, his small frame suggesting that he had not been eating well recently. His clothes, what remained of them after his ordeal, were well-made but travel-worn. This was not a child from a nearby village. He had come from far away, probably separated from his family during travel or a hunt gone wrong. The walk back to her cabin seemed endless. The child remained unconscious, his head lolling against her shoulder as she navigated the uneven ground. Sarah's mind raced with the implications of what she was doing. She was taking an Apache child into her home, caring for him, risking everything for someone whose people were considered enemies by every white settler in the territory. But as she looked down at his peaceful face, still streaked with mud but no longer twisted with fear, Sarah knew she could not have made any other choice. This was someone's son, someone's precious child, and he had needed help. In that moment by the creek, nothing else had mattered except the simple human imperative to preserve life. The cabin welcomed them with its familiar smells of wood smoke and dried herbs. Sarah laid the child on her own bed, the only soft surface in the sparse room, and began the process of cleaning him up. Warm water and soft cloths revealed bronze skin unmarked by serious injury, though exhaustion had claimed him completely. She covered him with her best quilt, the one her mother had made for her wedding, and settled into the chair beside the bed to keep watch. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor, Sarah found herself studying the child's face, trying to imagine the family that must be searching for him. His features spoke of strength and dignity even in sleep, and she could see the man he would become in the set of his jaw and the breadth of his forehead. Somewhere, parents were sick with worry, probably organizing search parties and following cold trails. The thought made her stomach clench with unexpected emotion. She had never had children of her own, had never known the fierce protectiveness that motherhood was supposed to bring. But sitting here in the gathering dusk, watching over this lost child, Sarah felt something stir in her chest that she had thought buried with her husband's broken dreams. Dawn broke with the soft gray light that preceded sunrise, and Sarah stirred in the wooden chair where she had kept vigil through the night. Her neck ached from the awkward position, but she had not wanted to leave the child alone. Every few hours she had checked his breathing, felt his forehead for fever, and adjusted the quilt that seemed determined to slip from his small frame. The boy's eyes opened as the first golden rays of sunlight streamed through the single window. For a moment he lay perfectly still, his dark gaze taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with the careful assessment of someone much older than his years. When his eyes found Sarah's face, she saw the instant wariness that replaced his initial confusion. He sat up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled despite what must have been lingering weakness from his ordeal. Sarah remained motionless in her chair, instinctively understanding that any sudden movement might be perceived as a threat. The child's gaze swept the cabin, cataloging every detail from the rifle hanging above the door to the herbs drying from the rafters. "You are safe here," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words meant nothing to him, she knew, but perhaps her tone would convey what language could not. She gestured toward herself and spoke her name clearly. "Sarah." Then she pointed to him with a questioning expression. The boy studied her for a long moment, weighing risks she could only imagine. Finally, he touched his chest and spoke a single word in a language that flowed like water over stones. The sounds were unfamiliar to her ears, but she understood that he had given her his name, a gesture of trust that felt precious as gold. Sarah rose slowly from her chair and moved toward the small kitchen area, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She had learned something about frightened creatures during her years of solitude, had coaxed injured birds back to health and earned the trust of wild things through patience and consistency. This child was no different except that the stakes were infinitely higher. She prepared a simple breakfast of cornbread and honey, adding a cup of cool water from the bucket she had filled before yesterday's dramatic interruption. The child watched every movement, his body tense and ready for flight despite his obvious exhaustion. When she approached the bed with the food, he pressed himself against the far wall, dark eyes never leaving her face. Sarah set the plate and cup on the small table beside the bed and retreated to her chair. She broke off a piece of her own cornbread and ate it slowly, demonstrating that the food was safe. The boy's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and she saw his internal struggle between hunger and caution. Gradually, drawn by needs stronger than fear, he reached for the cornbread. His first bite was tentative, testing for unfamiliar flavors or textures. When nothing alarming happened, he ate with the focused intensity of someone who had been without food for longer than was healthy. Sarah watched him drain the water cup and managed to refill it twice before his immediate hunger was satisfied. With food in his stomach, the child seemed to relax slightly. He was still watchful, still ready to bolt at the first sign of danger, but some of the rigid tension had left his small frame. Sarah found herself studying his face more openly now, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes and the proud set of his shoulders even in circumstances that would have broken many children. She began to speak to him in soft, conversational tones, not expecting understanding but hoping that the sound of her voice would continue the process of building trust. She told him about the creek where she had found him, about the quicksand that had nearly claimed his life, about her decision to bring him here where he could recover safely. As she spoke, the boy's expression grew more thoughtful. Several times he seemed on the verge of responding, but each time he held back, perhaps remembering lessons about the dangers of revealing too much to strangers. Sarah respected his caution even as she hoped to eventually earn his confidence. The morning passed in this careful dance of approach and retreat. Sarah went about her usual tasks, always keeping the child in sight, always moving slowly and predictably. She tended the fire, organized her meager supplies, and mended a tear in one of her skirts. The boy watched everything with the absorption of someone learning about an alien world. By midday, he had grown bold enough to explore the cabin while she worked. His movements were silent as shadow, and she marveled at how someone so young had already learned to move without sound. He examined her few possessions with the same careful attention he had given to her face upon waking, touching nothing but missing no detail. When he discovered the small collection of carved wooden animals that Thomas had made during the long winter evenings of their marriage, his expression changed entirely. Wonder replaced wariness as he studied the miniature bear, the running horse, the soaring eagle that had been her husband's masterpieces. Sarah saw him glance toward her questioningly, and she nodded permission for him to touch them. His hands were gentle as he lifted each carving, turning them in the light to appreciate the craftsmanship. When he found the eagle, something in his face shifted, and he spoke several words in his own language, his tones suggesting recognition or perhaps approval. Sarah wished desperately that she could understand what he was trying to tell her. The afternoon brought new challenges as the boy grew restless with recovery. He moved to the window several times, gazing out at the landscape with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Longing, perhaps, or calculation. She wondered if he was thinking of home, of family members who must be searching for him with growing desperation. As evening approached, Sarah faced a decision that had been weighing on her mind all day. The child was clearly strong enough to travel, and every hour he remained in her cabin increased the danger for both of them. If a search party found him here, if townspeople discovered what she had done, the consequences would be swift and severe. But looking at him now, still so small despite his obvious courage, still wearing clothes that were little more than rags after his ordeal, Sarah knew she couldn't simply send him back into the wilderness alone. Whatever the risks, whatever the cost to her own precarious security, she had to find a way to ensure his safe return to his people. The boy seemed to sense her internal struggle. He approached her chair and stood quietly, waiting until she looked up at him. When their eyes met, he spoke again in his liquid language, his tones serious and formal. Though she couldn't understand the words, Sarah heard gratitude in his voice, and something else that might have been a promise. The second morning brought with it a transformation that Sarah could never have anticipated. The boy who had been so cautious, so ready for flight, now moved through her small cabin with a quiet confidence that spoke of growing trust. He helped her gather eggs from the chickens without being asked, his movements careful and respectful of the bird's temperament. As they shared breakfast in companionable silence, Sarah noticed how he watched her hands as she worked, learning her routines and rhythms. When she began to clear the dishes, he rose to help, and together they established a wordless system of cooperation that felt surprisingly natural. It was during this domestic quiet that he first spoke his name clearly enough for her to understand. "Little Wolf," he said, pointing to himself with unmistakable pride. The English words came slowly, carefully pronounced, revealing that he knew more of her language than his initial silence had suggested. "Little Wolf," Sarah repeated, smiling at the fierce appropriateness of the name. He nodded approvingly at her pronunciation, then gestured toward her with a questioning expression. "Sarah," she said again, and watched as he practiced the syllables until they flowed smoothly from his lips. With this breakthrough in communication came a flood of information that both thrilled and terrified Sarah. Through a mixture of broken English, gestures, and crude drawings scratched in the dirt floor, Little Wolf began to tell her his story. He was indeed the son of a chief, as she had suspected from his bearing and the quality of his ruined clothes. His father was a man of great importance among their people, a leader whose influence extended far beyond their immediate tribe. The boy had become separated from a hunting party 3 days ago, he explained, his young face grave with the memory. A sudden storm had scattered the group, and in the confusion he had taken the wrong path. By the time he realized his mistake, he was lost in country he didn't recognize, with no clear way to find his people again. Sarah's heart clenched as she imagined his fear during those long hours of wandering. He was only a child, despite his precocious maturity, and the wilderness that surrounded her cabin was unforgiving to those who didn't know its dangers. The quicksand that had nearly claimed him was just one of many hazards that lay in wait for the unwary. Through careful questioning and patient listening, Sarah learned that his father's name was Thundercloud, a designation that carried weight even in her limited understanding of Apache culture. Thundercloud was known even among the white settlers, though the stories told about him varied wildly depending on who was doing the telling. Some painted him as a savage warrior bent on driving all whites from the territory. Others described him as a man of honor who kept his word and protected those under his care. Little Wolf's description of his father fell decidedly into the latter category. His eyes shone with pride as he spoke of Thundercloud's wisdom, his fairness in settling disputes, his skill as both warrior and peacemaker. This was clearly a child who adored his father and felt secure in that love, despite the harsh realities of their nomadic life. As the morning progressed, Little Wolf grew more animated in his storytelling. He described his mother, who had died when he was very young, and the grandmother who had taken over his care and education. He spoke of other children in the tribe, of games they played and lessons they learned, of ceremonies and celebrations that marked the turning of the seasons. Sarah found herself fascinated by this glimpse into a world she had only heard described in terms of violence and threat. Through Little Wolf's eyes, she saw a complex society with its own customs and values, its own ways of making sense of an often hostile world. These were not the savage monsters of settler nightmares, but people with families and hopes and fears much like her own. The realization both humbled and frightened her. If she had been wrong about the Apache, what else had she accepted without question? How many other assumptions about the world beyond her small experience might be equally flawed? Little Wolf seemed to sense her inner turmoil. He reached out and touched her hand gently, his dark eyes serious and understanding. "Good woman," he said in his careful English. "Help Little Wolf. Father, remember." The simple words carried enormous weight. Sarah understood that he was not just thanking her for her kindness, but making a promise on his father's behalf. In helping this child, she had created a bond that would not be forgotten. The question was whether that bond would prove to be a blessing or a curse. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Sarah made a decision that had been building in her mind since dawn. Little Wolf was strong enough to travel, and every hour that passed increased the likelihood that someone would discover him in her cabin. More importantly, his family would be frantic with worry, perhaps already mourning him as lost. She began gathering supplies for the journey, moving with the efficient purpose of someone who had learned to travel light. A small pack of food, a water skin, her father's old compass, and a blanket that might provide warmth during the cool desert nights. Little Wolf watched her preparations with growing excitement, understanding instinctively what they meant. When she brought out Thomas's hunting knife and strapped it to her belt, Little Wolf's expression grew troubled. He spoke rapidly in his own language, gesturing toward the weapon and shaking his head emphatically. Sarah realized that he was trying to warn her about something, perhaps about how his people might react to seeing an armed white woman approaching their territory. She considered his concern carefully, then made the decision to trust his judgment. The knife went back into its drawer, leaving her with only her wits and courage for protection. It was a calculated risk, but one that might mean the difference between being seen as a threat or as someone genuinely trying to help. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had been both sanctuary and prison, Sarah felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. She was about to venture into country where no white woman had ever traveled willingly, to seek out people who had every reason to view her with suspicion and hostility. The sensible thing would be to send Little Wolf on his way and retreat back into her familiar isolation. But as she looked at his eager face, saw the trust and affection there, Sarah knew that she could not abandon him now. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever consequences might follow, she would see this through to its conclusion. Little Wolf seemed to understand the magnitude of what she was risking for his sake. He approached her slowly, solemnly, and spoke a few words in Apache before translating them into English. "My father good man," he said. "Little wolf tell him Sarah good woman."
No Sarah.
The promise of a child, offered with all the gravity he could muster. Sarah hoped it would be enough to keep them both alive in the hours to come. The journey began in the pre-dawn darkness, when the world existed in shades of gray and shadow. Sarah had chosen this hour deliberately, knowing that curious eyes would be less likely to witness their departure. Little Wolf moved beside her with the silent grace of his people, his small hand occasionally touching her arm to guide her away from obstacles she might have missed in the dim light. As the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah felt the full weight of what she was attempting. The territory they were entering was unmapped by white settlers, known only through second-hand stories and military reports that painted it as hostile and impenetrable. Every step took them further from the familiar and deeper into a world where her presence might be seen as an act of war. Little Wolf seemed to sense her growing apprehension. He had grown more confident as they traveled, his posture straightening with each mile that brought him closer to home. Now he walked slightly ahead, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to Sarah's untrained eyes. Occasionally he would pause to study a rock formation or examine the ground, his young face serious with concentration. Through careful questioning during their rest stops, Sarah learned more about the boy's remarkable composure. This was not his first time traveling through difficult country, though it was certainly his first time being lost and alone. Thundercloud believed in teaching his children self-reliance from an early age, and Little Wolf had been accompanying hunting parties since he was old enough to sit a horse reliably. The knowledge both impressed and concerned Sarah. If Little Wolf was experienced enough to navigate this terrain, how had he become so thoroughly lost that he ended up trapped in quicksand miles from any known Apache territory? The answer, when it came, revealed the true scope of the crisis that had led to their meeting. Thundercloud's band had been forced to move from their traditional hunting grounds, Little Wolf explained as they sheltered from the midday sun beneath a rocky overhang. White soldiers had come with papers and ultimatums, demanding that the Apache relocate to lands that could not support their way of life. Rather than submit to slow starvation on the reservation, Thundercloud had chosen to lead his people deeper into the mountains, seeking territory that might offer both sanctuary and sustenance. The hunting party that Little Wolf had joined was not simply seeking game, but scouting new territory for the entire tribe. When the storm scattered them, he had not just lost his way back to camp, but had lost track of people who were themselves operating in unfamiliar country. The implications made Sarah's stomach clench with worry. If Thundercloud's band was constantly moving, how would they ever find them in this vast wilderness? Little Wolf seemed to read her thoughts. He pointed toward a distant peak that rose like a sentinel above the surrounding landscape, its summit crowned with what appeared to be ancient ruins. "Sacred place," he said in his careful English. "Father go there when need guidance. We find Father there." The mountain he indicated was at least 2 days' travel away, across terrain that looked increasingly rugged and forbidding. Sarah studied the route with growing trepidation, noting the deep canyons and steep ridges that would challenge even experienced travelers. But Little Wolf's confidence was absolute, and she found herself trusting in his knowledge despite her own doubts. As they resumed their journey, Sarah became aware of subtle changes in Little Wolf's behavior. He moved with increasing alertness, his head turning at sounds she couldn't hear, his eyes scanning the horizon with the intensity of a hunting animal. When she asked about his vigilance, his answer sent ice through her veins. "Apache scouts," he explained simply. "They watch us since morning. They know Little Wolf comes home." The revelation that they had been under observation for hours without her knowledge was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Terrifying because it demonstrated how completely out of her element she was in this environment. Comforting because it suggested that Little Wolf's people were aware of his return and were taking steps to ensure his safety. Throughout the afternoon, Sarah found herself looking for signs of the watchers Little Wolf claimed were following them. She saw nothing, heard nothing beyond the normal sounds of wind and wildlife, but the boy's certainty never wavered. Occasionally he would wave toward what appeared to be empty landscape, and Sarah imagined she could feel unseen eyes assessing her every movement. The weight of that scrutiny pressed down on her with each passing hour. These hidden watchers were undoubtedly reporting her presence to their leaders, describing the white woman who traveled with Thundercloud's son. What conclusions were they drawing from her appearance, her behavior, her obvious unfamiliarity with their world? Would they see her as a threat to be eliminated or a curiosity to be investigated? As evening approached, Little Wolf led them to a sheltered valley where a spring bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks. The spot showed signs of regular use, with fire rings and worn paths that spoke of generations of travelers who had found sanctuary here. Sarah realized that they had reached a place of significance in Apache culture, perhaps a neutral ground where even enemies might share water without conflict. Little Wolf went about the business of making camp with practiced efficiency, gathering firewood and preparing a simple meal from their supplies. Sarah watched him work, marveling at how this small boy seemed to belong so completely to this harsh landscape. Every movement was purposeful, every decision informed by knowledge passed down through countless generations of desert dwellers. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the clear desert sky, Sarah felt the full isolation of their situation settle around her like a physical weight. They were alone together in a wilderness that could kill the unwary in a dozen different ways, surrounded by unseen watchers whose intentions remained unknowable. Tomorrow would bring them closer to Little Wolf's people, but also deeper into territory where her presence might provoke reactions she couldn't predict or control. Little Wolf seemed to sense her inner turmoil. He moved closer to the small fire they had built, his young face serious in the flickering light. "Sarah, good woman," he said quietly. "Help Little Wolf when no help needed. Father, see this. Father, remember." The simple words carried a weight of promise that both comforted and frightened Sarah. She was beginning to understand that in saving this child's life, she had set in motion events that would ripple far beyond her small world. Whatever happened in the days to come, whatever consequences emerged from her impulsive act of compassion, there would be no going back to the simple isolation she had known. As Little Wolf curled up in his blanket and settled into sleep, Sarah took first watch, staring out into the star-filled darkness and wondering what dawn would bring. Somewhere out there, Thundercloud waited for news of his son. Tomorrow, she would discover whether her act of mercy would be seen as a gift or a threat by one of the most powerful Apache leaders in the territory. The second day of their journey dawned with an ominous stillness that set Sarah's nerves on edge. Even the desert wind had died away completely, leaving the landscape wrapped in an unnatural quiet that seemed to muffle every sound. Little Wolf noticed it too, his young face troubled as he studied the empty sky and motionless vegetation around their camp. "Something comes," he said simply, his English more halting when he was worried. "Big change in air. Animals know. They hide." Sarah looked around and realized he was right. The usual morning chorus of birds was absent, and she couldn't see so much as a lizard stirring among the rocks. It was as if the entire desert was holding its breath, waiting for something that only the wild creatures could sense approaching. They broke camp quickly and resumed their trek toward the sacred mountain, but the oppressive atmosphere seemed to follow them like a shadow. Little Wolf's earlier confidence had given way to a vigilant wariness that kept his eyes constantly moving across the landscape. Several times he paused to listen intently to sounds Sarah couldn't detect, his small body tense with concentration. As the morning wore on, Sarah began to understand the source of the boy's unease. The Apache scouts who had been following them were no longer maintaining their careful distance. Though she still couldn't see them directly, she caught glimpses of movement on distant ridges, shadows that appeared and vanished too quickly to be natural. Their watchers were closing in, and the reason for this change in behavior remained ominously unclear. Little Wolf confirmed her growing fears during their midday rest. "Many warriors come," he whispered, his voice barely audible even in the profound silence. "Not just scouts now. War party." The words sent ice through Sarah's veins. A war party meant armed men with hostile intentions, Apache warriors who might view her presence as an invasion to be repelled with deadly force. She thought of the weapons she had left behind in her cabin, of her naive assumption that good intentions would be enough to protect her in this harsh land. As people around the world follow this story of courage across cultural boundaries, I find myself wondering what time of day or night it is where you're listening. Are you somewhere safe, surrounded by familiar things, or are you also facing uncertainty in your own way? Whatever challenges you're confronting, remember that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single act of compassion. The afternoon brought their first direct contact with Little Wolf's people, though it came in a form Sarah had not expected. As they crested a rocky ridge, they found their path blocked by 3 Apache warriors mounted on painted horses. The men sat motionless as carved statues, their faces impassive as they studied the unlikely pair before them. Sarah's first impulse was to retreat, but Little Wolf stepped forward with a dignity that seemed remarkable in someone so young. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone respectful but confident, gesturing towards Sarah several times during his explanation. The warriors listened without interruption, their dark eyes never leaving Sarah's face. When Little Wolf finished speaking, the eldest of the three warriors dismounted and approached them on foot. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, his body marked with the scars of many battles, his bearing suggesting authority and experience. He studied Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl, as if he were looking not just at her appearance but into her very soul. The warrior spoke a few words to Little Wolf, who translated with obvious relief. He says, "You have kind heart but foolish head. White woman not belong in Apache land." But Little Wolf says you save his life, so you under protection of Thundercloud until you reach safe place. The pronouncement should have been reassuring, but something in the warrior's tone suggested that Sarah's safety was far from guaranteed. She was being granted safe passage, but as a barely tolerated intruder rather than a welcome guest. The distinction might prove crucial in the hours to come. The warriors escorted them for the remainder of the afternoon, maintaining a careful distance that allowed for surveillance without suggesting friendship. Sarah found their presence both comforting and unnerving. She was protected, but she was also clearly a prisoner, her movements monitored and her actions scrutinized by men who could end her life without a moment's hesitation. As evening approached, they reached a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, its walls rising like cathedral spires toward the darkening sky. This was clearly a place of great significance to the Apache, for the rock walls were decorated with ancient paintings that seemed to glow in the fading light. Sarah realized they had reached the sacred place Little Wolf had described, the mountain sanctuary where Thundercloud came to seek guidance. The camp that spread across the amphitheater floor was unlike anything Sarah had ever imagined. Perhaps 200 Apache had gathered here, their temporary shelters arranged in careful patterns that spoke of ancient customs and hierarchies. Fires flickered like stars throughout the encampment, and the sounds of conversation and daily life created a low murmur that echoed off the surrounding walls. Little Wolf's arrival caused an immediate stir of excitement. Warriors and women emerged from their shelters, children ran whooping across the camp, and elderly figures nodded with satisfaction at seeing the boy safe and unharmed. But their joy at his return was tempered by obvious confusion and concern about Sarah's presence. She found herself the center of countless stares, some curious, some hostile, all intensely interested in this unprecedented sight of a white woman walking freely among them. Little Wolf stayed close to her side, his small hand occasionally touching her arm in a gesture of reassurance and protection. His very presence seemed to be keeping the more hostile observers at bay. Through the crowd came a figure that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Thundercloud was not the savage monster of settler nightmares, but neither was he the gentle father she had imagined from Little Wolf's descriptions. He was a man in his prime, perhaps 35 years old, with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. His face was a mask of controlled emotion as he approached, giving nothing away about his intentions. When Thundercloud reached them, Little Wolf immediately began speaking in rapid Apache, his young voice bright with excitement and gratitude. Sarah caught her own name mentioned several times, along with words that she suspected described her rescue of the boy from the quicksand. Throughout the recitation, Thundercloud's eyes never left Sarah's face, studying her with an intensity that made her feel utterly transparent. When Little Wolf finished his account, Thundercloud spoke a single word in Apache. The crowd around them immediately began to disperse, though Sarah noticed that many people found reasons to linger within earshot. Whatever was about to happen, the entire tribe was intensely interested in witnessing it. Thundercloud stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the intelligence blazing in his dark eyes, the strength in his weathered hands, the scars that marked him as a veteran of many battles. When he spoke, his English was clear and precise, colored by an accent that made each word seem carefully chosen. "You save life of my son," he said, his voice carrying easily in the mountain stillness. "This creates debt that must be acknowledged. But you are white woman in Apache land during time of war. This creates problem that must be solved." Sarah realized that her simple act of compassion had created a complex diplomatic situation that could have far-reaching consequences for both their peoples. Thundercloud was caught between gratitude to the woman who had saved his child and the harsh realities of leading his people through increasingly dangerous times. The next few moments would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the future relationship between two worlds that seemed destined for conflict. The silence that followed Thundercloud's words stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Sarah could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, the collective breath of an entire tribe held in anticipation of her response. She understood instinctively that her next words would determine not just her own survival, but the nature of any future relationship between these people and the white world she represented. "I did not come here to create problems," she said finally, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I came only to return your son safely to his family." Nothing more was intended. Thundercloud studied her face as she spoke, his expression giving nothing away. When she finished, he turned to Little Wolf and spoke several words in Apache. The boy responded eagerly, his hands moving in animated gestures, as he supplemented his verbal account with physical demonstrations of Sarah's rescue efforts. The chief listened to his son's expanded story with the same careful attention he had given to Sarah's words. She noticed how his eyes softened slightly when Little Wolf described his terror in the quicksand, how his jaw tightened when the boy explained how long he had been lost and alone. This was a father hearing about his child's brush with death, and the human emotion breaking through his diplomatic reserve gave Sarah her first glimpse of the man behind the leader. When Little Wolf finished his recitation, Thundercloud was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between his son and the woman who had saved him. Sarah could see him weighing options, calculating consequences, struggling with a decision that clearly had implications far beyond this moment. "You could have sent runners to find us," he said at last. "You could have left boy at edge of your lands for us to discover. But you came yourself, alone, into country where white women do not travel. Why do you risk so much for child not your own?" The question struck to the heart of everything Sarah had been questioning about herself during their journey. Why had she made such a dangerous choice? What had driven her to abandon the safety of her isolated existence for this terrifying adventure into the unknown? "Because he was afraid," she answered simply. "Because he was alone. Because in that moment by the creek, he was not an Apache child or a white child, but simply a child who needed help. I could not have lived with myself if I had done less." Something shifted in Thundercloud's expression at her words. The rigid mask of diplomatic caution cracked slightly, revealing a flicker of what might have been respect or even approval. He spoke again to Little Wolf in Apache, and the boy nodded vigorously before turning to Sarah with a wide smile. "Father says you have warrior heart in woman body," Little Wolf translated. "Says debt to you is great, but problem of your presence is also great. Must think careful about what to do." Thundercloud gestured toward a group of elderly men who had been watching the proceedings from a respectful distance. At his signal, they approached and formed a loose circle around Sarah, Little Wolf, and the chief. Sarah realized she was witnessing the formation of some kind of council, a formal gathering that would determine her fate according to Apache law and custom. The discussion that followed was conducted entirely in Apache, with rapid exchanges between Thundercloud and the elders that sometimes grew heated. Sarah caught occasional glimpses of English words mixed into the flow of their native language, her own name mentioned frequently along with terms she suspected related to warfare, treaties, and the complex politics of survival in an increasingly hostile world. Little Wolf stayed close to her side throughout the deliberations, occasionally whispering brief translations when the discussion seemed to reach crucial points. The elders were divided, he explained quietly. Some wanted to honor the debt to Sarah by ensuring her safe return to white lands. Others worried that her presence in their camp, however innocent her intentions, could be used by their enemies as justification for military action against the tribe. As the debate continued, Sarah became aware of other conversations taking place throughout the camp. Small groups of warriors gathered around their own fires, their voices low but their gestures animated as they discussed the unprecedented situation. Women paused in their evening tasks to steal glances at the white stranger, their expressions revealing the same mixture of curiosity and concern she had seen in the faces of the council elders. The weight of representing her entire race in this moment was almost overwhelming. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, would be remembered and analyzed. If tensions between Apache and whites escalated in the future, her behavior here might be cited as evidence of settler intentions or character. The realization made her acutely conscious of how little she truly understood about the complex forces that had brought these two peoples into conflict. She had lived her entire life on the periphery of the frontier experience, isolated by widowhood and poverty from the political currents that shaped relations between Indians and settlers. Now she found herself at the very center of those tensions, her actions potentially influencing outcomes she could barely comprehend. Thundercloud seemed to reach some kind of decision, for he raised his hand and the council discussions gradually subsided. The elders resumed their seats, their faces grave but no longer openly hostile. Whatever conclusion they had reached, it appeared to offer some hope for peaceful resolution. Woman who saves Apache child is welcome at our fires this night, Thundercloud announced, his words carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet camp. Tomorrow we speak more of what must be done. But tonight you are guest under protection of Thundercloud's word. The formal pronouncement sent a visible wave of relaxation through the watching crowd. Children who had been peeking shyly from behind their mother's skirts now approached more boldly, their curiosity overcoming their caution. Women began moving toward Sarah with evident intent to include her in the evening's activities. Little Wolf beamed with pride and relief at his father's words. He took Sarah's hand and began leading her toward a large fire where several families were gathering for the evening meal. As they walked, he chattered happily in a mixture of Apache and English, clearly delighted to be showing off his new friend to his extended family. The warmth of the welcome Sarah received around that fire was completely unexpected. Despite the language barriers and cultural differences, she found herself drawn into conversations conducted largely through gestures and smiles. Women showed her their children, shared food from their cooking pots, and made efforts to teach her basic Apache words for common objects. As the evening progressed and the fires burned lower, Sarah began to understand something that would have seemed impossible just days before. These people, so demonized in the stories told by her own kind, were simply families trying to survive in an increasingly dangerous world. They loved their children, honored their elders, and found joy in small moments of connection and community. The revelation was both humbling and transformative. Sarah realized that her isolated existence had protected her from many truths, not just about Apache culture but about the complex realities of frontier life. She had been living in a simplified world of us and them, never questioning the assumptions that divided people into categories of friend and enemy. Now, sitting by an Apache fire under a canopy of desert stars, she wondered what other truths she had missed during her years of solitary exile from the human community. Dawn brought with it a commotion that shattered the peaceful quiet of the mountain camp. Sarah woke to the sound of horses arriving at speed, their hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Voices called out in urgent Apache, and she could hear Thundercloud responding with the sharp authority of a leader receiving unwelcome news. Little Wolf appeared at her side almost instantly, his young face tight with worry. "Soldiers coming," he whispered, his English more broken than usual in his distress. "Many soldiers. They look for Apache camps to destroy." The camp transformed with frightening efficiency from a peaceful gathering into a military operation. Warriors emerged from their shelters already armed and painted for war, while women began the swift process of packing essential belongings. Children who had been playing carelessly the night before now moved with the quiet discipline of those who had learned too young that survival depended on instant obedience. Thundercloud strode through the organized chaos, issuing orders that sent people scattering in different directions. When he reached Sarah, his expression was grim with the weight of impossible choices. "The scouts bring word that cavalry patrols are sweeping the mountains," he said without preamble. "They search for this camp, for my people. Your presence here has been reported." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. In her naive desire to help, she had inadvertently led danger to these people who had shown her nothing but kindness. The soldiers weren't just searching randomly. They were following her trail, using her journey as a guide to Apache strongholds that had remained hidden for generations. "I never meant for this to happen," she said, her voice thick with guilt and horror. "I thought I was helping. I thought I was doing something good." Thundercloud studied her stricken face with eyes that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. "You are a problem that creates more problems," he said finally. "But you are also woman who saved life of my son. Both things are true. Both must be considered." As morning light filled the canyon, Sarah began to understand the true scope of the crisis her presence had created. The approaching soldiers represented more than just immediate military threat. They were evidence that the careful balance Thundercloud had maintained between protecting his people and avoiding open warfare was beginning to collapse. The chief gathered his war council around him, and Sarah found herself included in the urgent discussions despite the language barriers. Through Little Wolf's translations and her own growing understanding of Apache words, she began to grasp the strategic dilemma facing the tribe. The soldiers were approaching from 3 directions, effectively cutting off the traditional escape routes that had allowed Thundercloud's people to avoid confrontation in the past. Worse, the patrols included Apache scouts from reservation tribes, men who knew the country well enough to track fleeing bands across terrain that would confuse white soldiers. Thundercloud's warriors were outnumbered and would be fighting on ground chosen by their enemies. A direct confrontation would likely result in the destruction of his entire band, including the women and children who depended on his protection. But surrender meant the slow death of reservation life, the gradual extinction of everything that made them who they were. As viewers across different time zones follow this moment of crisis, I wonder what difficult choices you might be facing in your own life right now. Sometimes our best intentions create unexpected consequences, and we must find the courage to face what comes next. Whatever challenges await us, remember that wisdom often emerges from the most impossible situations. Sarah listened to the debate with growing anguish, understanding that her presence had transformed a manageable situation into a potential catastrophe. Every option the warriors discussed seemed to lead to tragedy of one kind or another. Fight and die, or surrender and face cultural annihilation. It was during this desperate council that Thundercloud made a suggestion that stunned everyone present, including Sarah herself. "There is third path," he said quietly, his words cutting through the urgent discussions like a blade. "The woman returns to soldiers. She tells them she was held captive, that she escaped during night. She leads them away from this place while we retreat to winter grounds." The proposal hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, visible to all but interpreted differently by each observer. Some of the warriors nodded approvingly at the strategic brilliance of the plan. Others looked skeptical, questioning whether any white woman could be trusted with such a crucial deception. Little Wolf spoke up suddenly, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "Sarah, good woman," he declared in English, then repeated the statement in Apache for the benefit of the council members. "She saved Little Wolf life. She not lie to help enemies hurt Apache people." Thundercloud's eyes met Sarah's across the circle of warriors, and she saw the question there as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. Would she be willing to risk everything to help people who had been strangers to her just days before? Would she lie to her own kind to protect those who had shown her kindness? The request went against everything she had been taught about loyalty and tribal allegiance. She would be betraying her own race, actively working to deceive military forces that were supposedly protecting settler interests. If the deception were discovered, she would face charges of treason that could result in imprisonment or even execution. But as Sarah looked around the circle of faces watching her, she saw not the savage enemies of frontier mythology, but people who had welcomed her with generosity, despite every reason for suspicion. She thought of the women who had shared their food with her, the children who had shyly offered her small gifts, the elders who had nodded approvingly when she showed interest in their stories. Most importantly, she thought of Little Wolf, whose life she had saved on impulse, and whose gratitude had opened doorways she had never imagined existed. In helping this one child, she had discovered a world of complexity and beauty that challenged everything she thought she knew about the divisions between peoples. "I will do it," she said quietly, her words falling into the sudden silence like stones into still water. "I will tell them I was captured and escaped. I will lead them away from here." Thundercloud nodded slowly, respect flickering in his dark eyes. "This is dangerous path for white woman," he said. "If soldiers discover truth, you face punishment we cannot prevent. Why do you choose to help people not your own?" Sarah considered the question, searching for words that could explain the transformation that had taken place within her during these few extraordinary days. "Because they are my people now," she said finally. "Because Little Wolf is my people. Because kindness should not be bounded by the color of skin or the language of prayers." The chief's expression softened almost imperceptibly at her words. In that moment, Sarah glimpsed the man behind the war leader, the father who understood that some bonds transcended the artificial divisions created by fear and prejudice. "Then we have bargain," Thundercloud said formally. "You lead soldiers away from my people, and my people remember debt we owe you. Your name will be spoken with honor around Apache fires for generations yet to come." As the war council dispersed to begin implementing their desperate plan, Sarah felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a cloak. She was about to step fully into the space between two worlds, becoming something that had no name in either Apache or white society. The woman who saved an Apache child was about to become something far more complex and dangerous, a bridge between peoples who had forgotten how to trust. The preparation for Sarah's deception required careful attention to details that could mean the difference between life and death for an entire people. Thundercloud's warriors worked swiftly to create the appearance of a woman who had been held captive for days, disheveling her hair and tearing strategic holes in her dress, while leaving her fundamentally unharmed. More challenging was the need to give Sarah enough knowledge to make her story believable without revealing information that could endanger the tribe in the future. Thundercloud himself took charge of this delicate instruction, speaking to her in low, urgent tones as the camp prepared for evacuation around them. "You will tell soldiers you were taken 3 days ago from your cabin," he said, his English precise despite the pressure of time. "You will say Apache warriors found you alone and decided you could be useful as hostage for negotiations with white authorities. This explains why you are alive and unharmed." Sarah nodded, committing every detail to memory while trying not to think about the consequences of failure. If the soldiers detected any inconsistency in her story, if they suspected she was lying, the retribution would be swift and merciless. Thundercloud continued his briefing with the methodical thoroughness of a military commander. "You will say your captors spoke little English, that you learned nothing of their plans or numbers. You escaped last night when guards grew careless, and you have been wandering lost since then. This explains your appearance in this area without giving information about our movements." The chief paused in his instructions to study Sarah's face with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "You understand what you risk for people you barely know," he said quietly. "If you change mind, speak now. No shame in choosing safety of your own kind over welfare of strangers." Sarah met his gaze steadily, drawing strength from the gravity of his expression and the trust implicit in his words. "I will not change my mind," she said. "These people are no longer strangers to me. Your son is no longer a stranger to me." Something shifted in Thundercloud's expression at her words, a flicker of emotion that transformed his austere features for just an instant. When he spoke again, his voice carried a warmth that had been absent from their previous exchanges. "If you succeed in this deception, if you lead soldiers away and my people reach safety, then debt between us becomes something different," he said carefully. "Becomes connection that cannot be broken by distance or time or differences between our peoples." Before Sarah could fully process the implications of his words, Little Wolf appeared at her side with the heartbreaking solemnity of a child trying to be brave in the face of loss. He carried in his small hands a carved wooden eagle, the same figure she had seen him admire in her cabin what seemed like a lifetime ago. "For Sarah," he said, pressing the carving into her palm. "So you remember Little Wolf when far away. So you remember Apache people who call you friend." The simple gift nearly broke Sarah's composure entirely. She knelt to bring herself to the boy's eye level, seeing her own reflection in his dark eyes along with tears he was trying valiantly not to shed. "I could never forget you," she whispered, closing her fingers around the carved eagle. "You changed my life, Little Wolf. You showed me what courage really means." The boy threw his arms around her neck in a fierce embrace that lasted only seconds but seemed to contain years of affection and gratitude. When he pulled away, Sarah saw that Thundercloud was watching them with an expression of profound thoughtfulness. "Time comes for you to go," the chief said softly. "Soldiers approach from canyon mouth. They will find you wandering, confused, grateful for rescue. You remember story. You remember why you do this thing." Sarah rose to her feet, the carved eagle still warm in her palm from Little Wolf's touch. Around her, the last of the Apache were disappearing into the maze of canyons and hidden paths that would carry them to safety. Soon she would be alone again, but this time her solitude would serve a purpose greater than mere survival. Thundercloud walked with her to the edge of the camp, past the cold ashes of fires that had warmed her just hours before. At the point where she would begin her solo journey to meet the approaching soldiers, he stopped and turned to face her one final time. "What you do today makes you more than friend to Apache people," he said, his voice carrying the weight of formal pronouncement. "Makes you family. Makes you person with place in our hearts that cannot be taken away." He reached out and touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture that somehow conveyed more respect and acceptance than any elaborate ceremony could have managed. Then he was gone, melting into the landscape with the silent grace of his people, leaving Sarah alone with her courage and her carefully rehearsed deception. She began walking toward the approaching soldiers with deliberate steps, forcing herself to stumble occasionally and look over her shoulder as if still fearful of pursuit. The performance felt strange and artificial, but she knew that lives depended on her ability to convince hardened cavalry officers that she was nothing more than a fortunate escapee. The sound of horses reached her long before she saw the riders themselves. Sarah forced herself to collapse beside a large boulder, arranging herself to look exhausted and disoriented while keeping the carved eagle hidden in her closed fist. When the soldiers finally appeared around a bend in the canyon, she managed what she hoped was a convincing display of relief and gratitude. The officer in charge was a man of perhaps 40 years, his uniform bearing the insignia of a major in the territorial cavalry. His face was weathered by years of frontier service, and his eyes held the hard skepticism of someone who had seen too much to trust appearances. "Ma'am," he said, dismounting and approaching her with professional caution. "I'm Major Davidson. We've been searching for you since your neighbors reported you missing. Are you injured?" Sarah shook her head, allowing genuine exhaustion to color her voice, as she began the performance that would determine whether Thundercloud's people lived or died. "Thank God you found me," she gasped, letting tears flow freely down her dust-streaked cheeks. "I thought I would die out here. I thought I would never see civilization again." The Major helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness, his experienced eyes scanning her for signs of serious injury or abuse. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. "Take your time. You're safe now." And so Sarah began the most important lie of her life, weaving together truth and fiction with the skill of desperation and the motivation of love. As she spoke, painting a picture of captivity and escape that would send the soldiers racing in the wrong direction, she felt the weight of the carved eagle in her palm and drew strength from the knowledge that somewhere among the hidden canyons, a small boy and his people were beginning their journey to safety. Sarah's performance as the grateful escapee required every ounce of her strength and cunning. As Major Davidson listened to her carefully rehearsed story, she watched his weathered face for signs of suspicion or disbelief. The carved eagle remained hidden in her closed fist, its smooth surface a tangible reminder of why she was risking everything for people the Major would consider enemies. "They kept me for 3 days, she said, allowing her voice to tremble with what appeared to be remembered fear. "There were maybe a dozen warriors, perhaps more. They spoke very little English, so I couldn't understand their plans. I think they intended to use me in negotiations with the territorial government." Major Davidson nodded grimly, his expression suggesting that such tactics were familiar to him. "The Apache have used hostages before," he said. "You're fortunate they didn't decide you were more trouble than you were worth. Can you tell me anything about their camp, their numbers, their weapons?" Sarah forced herself to look uncertain, as if trying to recall details through the haze of trauma and fear. "The camp was in a canyon somewhere to the north," she said, gesturing vaguely in the direction opposite to where Thundercloud's people were actually retreating. "I couldn't see much because they kept me away from the main area. But there were many horses, and the men were well armed with rifles." The information was deliberately vague but convincing, designed to send the soldiers on a futile search through territory that Thundercloud's people had already abandoned. Sarah watched Major Davidson's face as he processed her words, noting how his tactical mind was already beginning to formulate pursuit plans. "How did you manage to escape?" the Major asked, his tone suggesting professional interest rather than suspicion. "Apache guards are usually quite vigilant." Sarah had rehearsed this part of her story most carefully, knowing it was the element most likely to raise questions. "Last night there was some kind of celebration or ceremony," she said. "The guards were drinking something that made them careless. I managed to slip away during the confusion and ran until I couldn't run anymore." The Major's expression suggested he found this explanation plausible. Apache warriors were known to consume tiswin during certain ceremonies, and the resulting intoxication could indeed create opportunities for escape that wouldn't otherwise exist. "You've been extraordinarily fortunate, Mrs. Mackenzie," he said, using the formal address that reminded Sarah of the vast gulf between her current deception and her true situation. "Many captives don't survive their first day in Apache hands." As the soldiers prepared to escort her back to civilization, Sarah felt the weight of what she was leaving behind pressing down on her like a physical burden. Somewhere in the maze of canyons and hidden valleys, Little Wolf was helping his people prepare for the long journey to winter grounds. Thundercloud was leading his band away from the sacred mountain that had been their sanctuary, driven once again into exile by forces beyond their control. The irony was almost overwhelming. By returning to the white world that had rejected her, Sarah was ensuring the safety of the Apache community that had accepted her with open hearts. By lying to people who shared her skin color and language, she was protecting those who had become more family to her than any blood relatives she had ever known. Major Davidson helped her mount one of the spare horses his patrol had brought, his manner courteous but impersonal. Once they began moving, Sarah realized that her deception was only the beginning of her challenges. She would have to maintain her fabricated story not just during the journey back to town, but through whatever official investigations might follow. More daunting still was the prospect of returning to her isolated cabin and resuming the lonely existence she had known before Little Wolf fell into the quicksand. How could she go back to that empty life now that she had experienced the warmth of genuine community? How could she pretend to be the same woman she had been just days before, when everything about her understanding of the world had been transformed? As they rode through country that had become familiar during her journey with Little Wolf, Sarah found herself seeing the landscape with new eyes. What had once seemed like empty wilderness now revealed itself as a complex homeland rich with history and meaning. Every rock formation, every hidden spring, every sheltered valley held significance in the Apache worldview that had been shared with her so generously. The soldiers rode with the casual alertness of men who had spent years patrolling hostile territory, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. Sarah knew they were hoping to spot evidence of the Apache band she had supposedly escaped from, eager for the chance to inflict decisive defeat on enemies who had frustrated them for so long. The knowledge that their search would prove fruitless gave Sarah grim satisfaction. Thundercloud's people were already hours ahead of any pursuit, following routes that had been used by their ancestors for generations. The soldiers might find cold campsites and false trails, but they would never catch the ghosts they were chasing. Major Davidson rode beside her for much of the journey, his conversation revealing a man who was neither cruel nor stupid, but who had been shaped by years of frontier warfare into seeing the world in terms of us and them. He spoke of Apache raids on settler families, of ambushes that had killed good soldiers, of the impossible task of maintaining peace in a territory where two incompatible ways of life were locked in deadly competition. Sarah listened to his stories with new understanding, recognizing truths on both sides that neither group seemed able to acknowledge. The settlers he described were people like herself, trying to build lives in an unforgiving land, genuinely fearful of threats they couldn't predict or control. But the Apache he portrayed as savage enemies were also people like Thundercloud and Little Wolf, fighting to preserve their way of life against forces that seemed bent on their complete destruction. The tragedy was that both sides had legitimate grievances and reasonable fears. Both groups contained individuals capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty. Both were trapped in a cycle of violence and retribution that benefited no one except those who profited from continued conflict. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Sarah caught sight of familiar landmarks that meant they were approaching the boundaries of white settlement. Soon she would be back in the world of suspicious neighbors and empty cabins, required to resume the role of the grieving widow who kept to herself and bothered no one. But the carved eagle in her pocket would remain as proof that her encounter with Thundercloud's people had been real. Whatever happened in the days and months to come, she would carry with her the memory of being accepted and valued by people who had every reason to treat her as an enemy. The Major's voice broke into her reverie as he pointed toward a column of smoke rising in the distance. "That would be the settlement," he said with satisfaction. "You'll be able to rest properly tonight, and tomorrow we can begin organizing search parties based on the information you've provided." Sarah nodded and managed what she hoped was an appropriate expression of relief and gratitude. But inside, her heart was already turning back toward the hidden canyons, where her true family was beginning a new chapter in their long struggle for survival and dignity. The return to her cabin felt like entering a tomb. Sarah stood in the doorway, looking at the familiar objects that had once defined her world, and found them strange and meaningless. The rough wooden table where she had eaten solitary meals, the narrow bed where she had slept dreamless sleep, the few possessions that had represented the sum total of her existence, all seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Major Davidson had escorted her personally to ensure her safety, his manner professionally courteous as he helped her settle back into what he assumed was the sanctuary she had longed to reach. The irony was almost unbearable. This place that others saw as her refuge now felt like a prison, cutting her off from the people who had become her true family. "You'll want to rest, ma'am," the Major said, his weathered face showing genuine concern for her supposed ordeal. "I'll post a guard for tonight, just to be safe. Tomorrow we'll begin the search for the band that held you captive." Sarah nodded and thanked him with what she hoped was appropriate gratitude, all the while knowing that his search would lead only to cold ashes and empty canyons. Thundercloud's people were already miles away, following ancient routes toward winter grounds that no white man had ever seen. After the soldiers departed, Sarah found herself alone with silence that seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical weight. The absence of the sounds that had filled the Apache camp, the voices of children playing, the low conversations of women working, the quiet discussions of men planning for their people's survival, made her cabin feel like a mausoleum. She moved through the motions of normal life like a sleepwalker, preparing a simple meal she had no appetite to eat, checking the chickens who seemed to regard her with suspicious indifference. Everything was exactly as she had left it, yet nothing felt the same because she was no longer the same woman who had lived here. The carved eagle remained hidden in her pocket, too precious and dangerous to display openly. Sometimes she would touch it through the fabric of her dress, drawing comfort from its smooth surface and the memories it represented. Little Wolf's gift was her only tangible connection to the world she had glimpsed and lost, the community where she had finally understood what belonging truly meant. As evening fell, Sarah sat on her porch and watched the familiar landscape transform in the fading light. The same hills and valleys stretched before her, but now she knew they were home to people whose existence most of her neighbors refused to acknowledge as fully human. Somewhere beyond those ridges, families were gathering around fires, sharing food and stories, living lives rich with meaning and connection. The isolation that had once seemed like peaceful solitude now felt like exile from everything that mattered. Sarah had tasted genuine community, had experienced what it meant to be valued for her character rather than judged for her circumstances, and the return to loneliness was almost physically painful. Sleep brought no relief, only dreams filled with faces she might never see again and voices speaking words in a language she was only beginning to understand. She woke repeatedly throughout the night, reaching instinctively for the carved eagle as if it were a talisman that might transport her back to where she truly belonged. The next morning brought visitors that Sarah had been dreading. News of her dramatic rescue had spread through the settlement, and neighbors who had ignored her for months now appeared at her door with expressions of concern and curiosity. Their questions about her captivity required careful answers, each response weighted with the knowledge that a careless word could endanger the people she was protecting. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife who had previously crossed the street rather than acknowledge Sarah's existence, now sat in her kitchen with the avid attention of someone hungry for dramatic details. "You must have been terrified," she said, her eyes bright with the ghoulish fascination that drew people to stories of suffering. "What did those savages do to you?" The casual dehumanization in the woman's tone made Sarah's stomach clench with anger and disgust. These savages, as Mrs. Henderson called them, had shown her more genuine kindness than any of her white neighbors had offered in 2 years of widowhood. Thundercloud had treated her with more respect and dignity than the so-called civilized people who now gathered in her cabin like vultures drawn to carrion. "They kept me as a hostage," Sarah said carefully, sticking to the story she had rehearsed. "I was fortunate to escape when their guard was down. I don't wish to dwell on the experience." But the visitors were not easily discouraged. They wanted details about Apache customs, about their numbers and weapons, about their plans and intentions. Each question felt like a betrayal of the trust Thundercloud had placed in her. Each answer another small violation of the bonds she had formed with his people. As evening approaches in different parts of the world where you're following this story, I wonder if you've ever felt caught between two worlds, forced to choose between competing loyalties. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are the ones within ourselves, when our hearts pull us in directions our minds say are impossible. By afternoon, Sarah could no longer bear the parade of curiosity seekers and gossip mongers. She claimed exhaustion from her ordeal and asked to be left alone to recover, a request that was grudgingly honored but clearly considered selfish and ungrateful. Alone again, Sarah found herself drawn to the creek where she had first encountered Little Wolf. The quicksand that had nearly claimed his life had been stirred by recent rains, its treacherous surface now smooth and innocent-looking. She knelt beside the water where she had filled her bucket on that fateful morning, trying to recapture the sense of purpose that had driven her to risk everything for a frightened child. The memory of Little Wolf's terror-filled eyes remained vivid in her mind, along with the moment when fear had transformed into trust as he grasped the branch she offered. That single act of compassion had opened doorways she could never have imagined, leading her into a world where the artificial divisions between peoples dissolved in the face of simple human need. Now she was trapped between those worlds, belonging fully to neither, carrying secrets that isolated her more completely than poverty or widowhood ever had. She could not share her true experiences with her white neighbors, who would see her actions as treachery. But neither could she return to the Apache community that had welcomed her, for such a choice would mark her as a renegade and put Thundercloud's people at even greater risk. The carved eagle seemed to grow heavier in her pocket as Sarah contemplated the impossible future stretching before her. She had gained a family only to lose them, had discovered her true home only to be exiled from it by circumstances beyond her control. Yet as she sat beside the creek in the gathering dusk, Sarah felt something stirring within her that had not been there before her encounter with Thundercloud's people. It was a strength born of knowing who she truly was beneath the roles society had assigned her, a quiet confidence that came from having her character tested and proven worthy. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever sacrifices her dual existence might require, She would endure them with the dignity Thundercloud had recognized in her. She had been transformed by love and acceptance into someone capable of standing between worlds, of serving as a bridge between peoples who had forgotten how to see each other's humanity. The woman who had once hidden from the world in lonely isolation was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true belonging came not from the accident of birth or the color of skin, but from the choice to value compassion over prejudice, connection over separation, love over fear. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's return to what others called civilization, and each day felt like a year of slow suffocation. The routine that had once provided structure to her solitary existence now seemed like an elaborate prison, each familiar task a reminder of how completely she had been cut off from the life that had given her meaning. The search parties Major Davidson had organized based on her fabricated information had returned empty-handed, exactly as she had known they would. The soldiers spoke of cold camps and false trails, of Apache bands that seemed to vanish like smoke whenever pursuit grew close. Sarah listened to their frustrated reports with carefully hidden satisfaction, knowing that Thundercloud's people were safe in their winter grounds. But the success of her deception brought its own burdens. The townspeople who had once ignored her now regarded her as a minor celebrity, someone whose brush with death at Apache hands had made her worthy of attention and sympathy. The irony was bitter beyond bearing. She was celebrated for surviving an ordeal that had actually been the most meaningful experience of her life. Mrs. Henderson continued to visit regularly, always hungry for new details about Sarah's supposed captivity. Her questions had grown more persistent and invasive as the weeks passed, probing for inconsistencies in Sarah's story with the instincts of someone who sensed that important information was being withheld. "You seem remarkably recovered for someone who endured such trauma," the banker's wife observed during one particularly uncomfortable visit. "Most women would be prostrated by such an experience. Yet you appear almost strengthened by it." Sarah forced herself to maintain the careful balance between grateful survivor and traumatized victim that her role required. "I suppose I am stronger than I knew," she replied, the words carrying more truth than Mrs. Henderson could possibly understand. "Sometimes we discover reserves of courage we never knew we possessed." The carved eagle remained hidden in her pocket, its smooth surface worn smooth by nervous fingers that sought comfort in its familiar contours. Sometimes at night, Sarah would take it out and study it by lamplight, remembering little Wolf's solemn face as he pressed it into her hands. The small wooden bird was her only tangible connection to a world she was beginning to fear she would never see again. It was during one of these lonely vigils that Sarah heard the sound that changed everything. Horses approaching in the darkness, moving with the careful stealth of riders who did not wish to be detected. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she extinguished her lamp and moved to the window, peering out into the star-filled night. 3 figures sat motionless on horseback at the edge of the clearing around her cabin. Even in the darkness, Sarah recognized the proud posture and natural grace that marked them as Apache warriors. For a moment she wondered if she was dreaming, if her desperate longing had conjured visions from the realm of sleep and wishful thinking. Then one of the riders dismounted and approached her cabin with movements she would have recognized anywhere. Thundercloud walked like no other man she had ever known, with the fluid confidence of someone who belonged completely to the land beneath his feet. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the door, her breath catching at the sight of the man who had haunted her thoughts for endless weeks. Thundercloud stood before her in the moonlight, no longer the diplomatic chief managing a crisis, but simply a man whose presence filled the empty spaces in her heart. "You are well," he said quietly, his English careful and precise as always. "This is good. There was concern among my people about white women who risked much to help Apache children." The sound of his voice after so many weeks of silence nearly broke Sarah's composure entirely. She stepped aside to let him enter, acutely aware of how small and shabby her cabin must seem compared to the vast landscapes he called home. "I hoped you were safe," she whispered, afraid to speak louder lest she wake from what still felt like an impossible dream. "I have thought of you every day, wondered if the soldiers found you, if little Wolf was well." Thundercloud's expression softened at the mention of his son. "Little Wolf speaks of you often," he said. "Asks when Sarah will come back to Apache people. Difficult to explain to child why woman who saved his life must live alone among people who do not value her properly." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, exposing the central wound that had been festering since her return. She had found her true family only to be separated from them by forces beyond anyone's control, trapped by circumstances that made honest connection impossible. "I want to come back," she said, the admission torn from her heart before her mind could censor it. I want to be with people who see me as I truly am, not as what society expects me to be. But I cannot bring danger to your people. My presence would give the soldiers excuse to hunt you even more aggressively. Thundercloud moved closer, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel utterly transparent. The danger exists whether you are with us or not, he said quietly. White authorities will always find reasons to attack Apache people. But you could be with those who value you, instead of living among those who see you only as curiosity or burden. The offer hung between them like a bridge spanning impossible distances. Sarah understood that Thundercloud was not just inviting her to rejoin his band, but proposing a complete transformation of her existence. She would be leaving behind not just her cabin and possessions, but her entire identity as a white woman living on the edges of settler society. What would I become? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I know nothing of Apache ways, cannot speak your language properly, have no skills that would make me useful to your people. Thundercloud's rare smile transformed his austere features, revealing warmth that had been carefully hidden beneath diplomatic reserve. You would become what you already are, he said simply. Woman of courage who puts welfare of children above safety of self. Person who sees beyond color of skin to heart beneath. This is what Apache people value most. He reached out and touched her hand gently, his fingers warm against her cold skin. You saved life of my son, he continued. This creates bond that cannot be broken by time or distance. But more than this, you chose to protect my people when protecting them meant betraying your own kind. This makes you family in ways that blood alone cannot achieve. Sarah felt tears she had been holding back for weeks finally spill over, carrying with them the accumulated loneliness and frustration of her exile. Everything she had dreamed of during the endless nights of isolation was being offered freely. The belonging she had tasted briefly and thought lost forever. But with the joy came fear that seemed almost as overwhelming. Accepting Thundercloud's offer would mean abandoning every assumption about herself that she had ever held. She would be choosing to live as an outsider in both worlds, belonging fully to neither white nor Apache society. I am afraid, she admitted, her honesty surprising even herself. Afraid of what I would become, afraid of what I would lose, afraid of being a burden to people who have already risked so much. Thundercloud's hand tightened gently around hers, his touch conveying understanding and acceptance. Fear is wise companion when making choices that change everything, he said. But fear should not prevent us from claiming happiness that is offered freely. My people have discussed this. You are wanted. You are needed. You are already family. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Sarah realized that the most important decision of her life could no longer be postponed. The safe, lonely existence she had known was slipping away like water through her fingers, replaced by possibilities that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The decision that would reshape Sarah's entire existence required no lengthy deliberation. As Thundercloud stood waiting in the growing dawn light, she felt the last chains of her old life falling away like leaves in autumn wind. The woman who had lived in fearful isolation, accepting society's judgment of her worth, was ready to step fully into the person she had discovered herself to be. I will come with you, she said simply, her voice steady with newfound certainty. This is not my home anymore. My home is with people who see value in kindness rather than status, who measure worth by character rather than circumstances. Thundercloud's expression revealed satisfaction and something deeper, a warmth that transformed his austere features entirely. You choose difficult path, he said quietly. Life with Apache people will not be easy for white woman. But you will never again be alone. Never again be without family who values what you bring to their lives. Sarah moved through her cabin one final time, gathering the few possessions that held genuine meaning. Her mother's Bible, Thomas's carving tools, the dress she had worn on her wedding day. Everything else, the accumulated debris of a life lived in isolation, could remain as monuments to the woman she was leaving behind. The carved eagle emerged from her pocket for the first time since her return, its polished surface catching the morning light like a promise fulfilled. This small gift from Little Wolf had sustained her through weeks of exile, reminding her that love could transcend the artificial boundaries that divided peoples. As she prepared to leave forever the only life she had ever known, Sarah felt not grief but profound relief. The cabin that had sheltered her would become someone else's refuge. The neighbors who had judged her would find new subjects for their gossip and speculation. But she would finally be free to become the person her experiences had revealed her to be. Thundercloud helped her mount the horse his warriors had brought, his hands gentle but sure as he ensured her comfort and safety. The gesture spoke of protection freely offered, of a place waiting for her in a community that valued what she could contribute rather than dwelling on what she lacked. The journey to the Apache winter camp passed like a waking dream. Sarah found herself seeing the landscape through new eyes, no longer as empty wilderness to be endured, but as homeland to be cherished. Every valley and ridge held stories that Thundercloud shared with her, tales of his people's connection to this land that stretched back through countless generations. As they traveled, Thundercloud spoke of the changes her presence would bring to both their lives. "You will learn Apache ways," he said, his voice carrying the patience of someone prepared to teach with infinite care. "But you will also keep best parts of who you are. My people need bridge between worlds, person who understands both sides of great divide." The winter camp revealed itself gradually, hidden in a valley so perfectly concealed that Sarah understood why no military patrol had ever found it. Smoke from cook fires rose straight into the still air, and the sounds of daily life created a symphony of belonging that made her heart race with anticipation. Little Wolf was the first to spot their arrival, his joyful cry bringing people running from all directions. The boy who had grown noticeably taller during their separation launched himself into Sarah's arms with the uncomplicated happiness of childhood, his embrace conveying forgiveness for her long absence and delight at her return. "Sarah come home," he announced to the gathering crowd, his English more confident than she remembered. "Sarah part of family now. Father says she stay forever." The welcome Sarah received from Thundercloud's people overwhelmed her with its generosity and warmth. Women who remembered her kindness during her brief previous visit embraced her like a sister returning from a long journey. Children who had been shy during her first encounter now approached boldly, eager to show her games and treasures they had been saving for her return. But it was the reaction of the tribal elders that moved Sarah most deeply. These dignified men and women, keepers of Apache wisdom and tradition, nodded their approval as Thundercloud formally announced her adoption into the tribe. Their acceptance meant that she was not just tolerated as an outsider, but genuinely embraced as family. As people around the globe witnessed this moment of belonging across cultural boundaries, I wonder what walls you might be ready to cross in your own life. Sometimes our greatest adventures begin when we have the courage to leave behind what's familiar for what's true to our hearts. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Sarah could have imagined. Words were spoken in Apache that she did not yet understand, but their meaning was clear in the faces of those around her. She was being given a name in their language, a place in their social structure, a role in their ongoing story of survival and adaptation. Thundercloud stood beside her throughout the ritual, his presence both protective and proud. When the formal ceremonies concluded, he drew her aside for a conversation that would define the nature of their future relationship. "You are now Apache woman in eyes of my people," he said, his English careful and formal. "But I want you to know that choice is yours about what this means between us. You are free to find your own path, to marry a Apache man who suits you, to build life according to your own desires." Sarah looked into his dark eyes and saw the question he was too honorable to ask directly. She understood that he was offering her complete freedom even as he hoped she might choose to bind her fate to his. The realization that this powerful leader would subordinate his own desires to her autonomy filled her with wonder and deep affection. "I did not cross between worlds to remain alone," she said quietly, her words carrying more meaning than their simple surface suggested. "I came here to be with people who value what I have to offer. Most especially, I came to be with the man who showed me what true strength and honor look like." Thundercloud's rare smile transformed his entire expression, revealing joy that had been carefully hidden beneath diplomatic restraint. "Then we will build life together," he said simply. "Apache and White, two peoples becoming one family, showing our children that love is stronger than fear." The seasons that followed brought changes that Sarah could never have anticipated during her years of isolation. She learned to speak Apache fluently, to prepare foods that nourished both body and spirit, to read the subtle signs that revealed the desert's moods and intentions. But more importantly, she learned what it meant to be part of a community where every person's contribution was valued and every child was cherished by all. Her marriage to Thundercloud was celebrated by both their peoples, a union that symbolized hope for understanding between worlds that had seemed destined for eternal conflict. Their children would grow up belonging to both cultures, serving as bridges between communities that desperately needed to learn from each other. Little Wolf, now her son-in-law as well as spirit, often reminded Sarah of the day she had pulled him from the quicksand. "You saved my life, he would say with the gravity of approaching manhood. But I think maybe I saved yours too. We saved each other. Years later, as Sarah sat by her fire watching grandchildren play in the mountain meadows, she would remember the morning when a child's cry for help had changed everything. That single moment of compassion had led her from isolation to belonging, from fear to love, from existing to truly living. The carved eagle, now worn smooth by countless hands and passing years, rested on a place of honor in her home. It served as a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness can reshape entire worlds, that courage often begins with simply reaching out to help someone in need, and that family is not defined by blood alone but by the choice to love without conditions. In choosing to save little Wolf, Sarah had ultimately saved herself, discovering in the process that home is not a place but a feeling, not a building but a belonging, not an inheritance but a choice freely made and joyfully embraced.